Lamarr, January 19th, 2000. In a small Florida house the woman once called the most beautiful in the world lay dead, alone, forgotten. What her neighbors never knew was that every Wi-Fi signal, every GPS ping, every Bluetooth device carried her genius. The mailbox read only a number. No Hollywood glamour, no trace of the name that had once commanded millions. Inside, silence. Outside, a world connected by technology she had birthed in secret while she died in isolation she had chosen. The call came at dawn. Her daughter, Denise, would fly in from Seattle. Her son, Anthony, from California. But they would arrive too late to bridge the chasm that had grown between their famous mother and the world that had simultaneously worshipped and misunderstood her. In death, as in her final years, Hedy Lamarr remained an enigma, a woman whose beauty had made her a legend, but whose brilliant mind had been systematically ignored and forgotten. What the neighbors in Castleberry didn't know, what Hollywood had never truly understood, was that in the 1940s, while posing for magazine covers and delivering lines scripted by men, Hedy Lamarr had quietly invented the technology that would one day become the backbone of wireless communication. Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, GPS. Every time someone picked up their phone or connected to the internet, they were using principles developed by the same woman who now lay forgotten in a modest Florida home. The paradox was staggering. The world had connected through her invention, yet she had died alone. Was this death truly the natural end of a long life? Or was it the final chapter in a tragedy that had been unfolding for decades? The woman who had given humanity the gift of connection had spent her final years disconnected from humanity itself. But to understand how it all ended, we must first understand how it all began. The year was 1914, and the Habsburg Empire still cast its shadow across Central Europe. In the affluent Döbling district of Vienna, amid tree-lined streets where the wealthy built their mansions, a daughter was born to Emil and Gertrude Kiesler. They named her Hedwig Eva Maria, though the world would come to know her by a different name entirely. This was not just any birth. This was the arrival of a mind that would bridge two worlds that society insisted could never coexist: devastating beauty and revolutionary intelligence. Emil Kiesler was a man of precision and curiosity, a deputy director at the prestigious Wiener Bankverein, who saw numbers not just as figures but as puzzles to be solved. His wife, Gertrude, was a concert pianist whose fingers could coax symphonies from ivory keys, a woman who understood that beauty and complexity could coexist in perfect harmony. Their only child would inherit both traits: the analytical mind of her father and the artistic soul of her mother, though society would only choose to see one half of her gifts. From her earliest memories, Hedwig displayed a restless intelligence that couldn't be contained. At age 5, while other children played with dolls, she could be found dismantling her music box with the focused intensity of a master craftsman, studying each spring and gear until she understood how melody emerged from mechanism. But even then, she was already being half seen. Praised when she won beauty contests at 12, ignored when she asked how printing presses worked. Could these early signs have predicted the lifetime of being misunderstood that lay ahead? Her father, recognizing this hunger for knowledge, became her first teacher and greatest advocate. Together they would walk the cobblestone streets of Vienna, Emil patiently explaining the inner workings of the printing presses, the streetcars, the very heartbeat of the city itself. "How does this work, Papa?" became her constant refrain, and Emil never tired of answering. These walks weren't just education, they were prophecy. The curious girl who dissected music boxes would one day dissect the very nature of communication itself. At 16, her parents enrolled her in Max Reinhardt's prestigious acting school in Berlin. Here, surrounded by other young dreamers and artists, Hedwig first tasted the theatrical world that would define her public image. Yet even as she learned to project her voice and command a stage, her private notebooks filled with sketches of mechanical devices and mathematical equations. She was becoming fluent in two languages, the language of performance and the language of invention, though she had no idea how brutally society would insist she choose between them. But it was her next role that would change everything. 1933 Prague. The film, Ecstasy. A young woman's face luminous in black and white. She's nude, running through a forest. In theaters across Europe, audiences gasped. A legend was born, and a prison constructed. At 18, Hedwig Kiesler had become internationally famous and simultaneously trapped. The world had seen her body before it had any interest in her mind. She was already being half understood, celebrated for shocking cinema, dismissed for the sharp wit that chose such a daring role. The film's success brought an immediate consequence. Marriage to Friedrich Mandl, a wealthy Austrian munitions manufacturer 33 years old to her 18. He promised to protect her from scandal, but protection quickly became imprisonment. The wedding took place at the Karlskirche in Vienna, one of the most beautiful churches in the city. But for Hedwig, walking down that ornate aisle felt like walking toward her own execution. At 18, she was becoming the property of a man who saw her beauty as both an asset and a threat, something to be displayed when useful and hidden when inconvenient. Mandl's wealth afforded him considerable power in Austria's industrial circles, and his munitions company had contracts with both Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The dinner parties began. Mahogany tables, crystal glasses, cigar smoke, military contracts spread between the wine bottles, engineers sketching torpedo guidance systems on napkins, fascist officials toasting new weapons contracts. And there, silent, stunning, supposedly decorative, sat 18-year-old Hedwig Mandl. They wanted her to be seen but not heard, beautiful but not thinking. She played the temptress on screen, but at these dinners she absorbed equations, always half understood. They saw the trophy wife. She was memorizing radio frequencies, torpedo trajectories, the vulnerabilities of remote-controlled weapons. Was this forced education in the machinery of war perhaps the most crucial classroom of her life? The young woman who had dismantled music boxes was now witnessing the dismantling of entire communication systems, learning firsthand the weaknesses that would later inspire her greatest invention. Mandl, meanwhile, grew increasingly possessive and controlling. He tried to buy up all existing copies of Ecstasy to erase evidence of his wife's scandalous past. He forbade her from acting and kept her virtually imprisoned in their castle, Schloss Schwarzenau. The woman who had once dismantled music boxes out of curiosity was now a gilded prisoner, her intelligence suffocated by silk gowns and meaningless social obligations. But imprisonment breeds revolution, and Hedwig began planning her escape. In 1937, she drugged her maid, took her uniform, and fled to Paris with nothing but the clothes on her back and the knowledge in her head. She was 23 years old, penniless but free. The girl who had entered marriage as Hedwig Kiesler would soon emerge from it as someone else entirely. Freedom, however, came with its own challenges. In Paris, she lived modestly, using her savings to survive while planning her next move. The scandal of Ecstasy followed her everywhere, but so did her reputation as a talented actress. When she learned that Louis B. Mayer, the powerful head of MGM Studios, was traveling to London, she bought herself a first-class ticket on the same ship to New York. The crossing was her audition for a new life. By the time the ship docked, she had a $500 a week contract and a new identity. Mayer, inspired by silent film star Barbara Lamarr, christened her Hedy Lamarr. The Austrian refugee Hedwig Kiesler was officially dead. In her place stood a Hollywood invention, a manufactured dream designed to captivate American audiences. But what Mayer didn't realize What Hollywood would never fully understand was that beneath the glamorous surface, the curious mind that had dismantled music boxes and absorbed lessons in military technology was very much alive. Her American debut in Algiers, 1938, established her as an instant sensation. Paired with Charles Boyer, she played a woman torn between duty and desire, and audiences were transfixed by her exotic beauty and magnetic screen presence. Variety praised her natural acting ability, though Boyer himself grumbled that she couldn't act. The criticism stung, but it also revealed the central conflict that would define her Hollywood years. Was she a serious artist or merely a beautiful object? Under contract to MGM, Hedy found herself trapped in a different kind of prison. Where Mandel had locked her away from the world, Hollywood locked her into a narrow definition of femininity. She was cast repeatedly as the exotic temptress, the dangerous beauty, the woman whose primary function was to look stunning while men around her carried the dramatic weight of the narrative. Films like White Cargo, 1942, showcased her beauty but offered little opportunity to demonstrate any depth or intelligence. The MGM publicity machine worked overtime to craft her image. Photo shoots, magazine covers, interviews where she was asked about her beauty routine but never about her thoughts or ambitions. "Any girl can be glamorous," she told reporters with growing frustration. "All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." The irony was lost on most of her audience. The world's most beautiful woman was essentially calling herself stupid, but no one was listening carefully enough to hear the pain behind the quip. After 12 or 15-hour days on set, while other stars attended parties or pursued Hollywood's social scene, Hedy had different plans. Beverly Hills mansion, midnight. Studio lights were off. Klieg lights had cooled. But in one room, a single lamp illuminated a wooden table covered with gears, springs, drafting tools, technical manuals stacked beside movie scripts. The world saw a goddess. She was building a laboratory. Her inventing table, a workspace where the curious girl from Vienna could finally breathe. Here she worked on tissue dispensers, improved dog collars, traffic light modifications. Nothing revolutionary yet, but the mind that had dismantled music boxes was awakening. Hollywood wanted a goddess. She wanted a lab. Could this contradiction have been more complete? By day, she embodied every fantasy about feminine beauty and submission. By night, she wrestled with mechanical problems and mathematical equations. The transformation became complete with her relationship with Howard Hughes, the eccentric aviation magnate who shared her passion for innovation. Hughes recognized what the movie industry had missed, that behind Hedy's beautiful face was a genuinely brilliant mind. He encouraged her inventive instincts, giving her a small set of tools to use in her trailer between takes and inviting her to tour his aircraft factories. Their collaboration revealed the depth of her technical thinking. When Hughes wanted to design faster aircraft for the military, Hedy approached the problem with characteristic methodical precision. She purchased books on fish and birds, studying the fastest examples of each species. Then she combined the fins of the fastest fish with the wings of the fastest bird to create new wing designs for Hughes's planes. When she presented her sketches to him, his response was immediate. "You're a genius." It was perhaps the first time anyone in America had recognized her intelligence. But genius, Hedy was learning, could be as isolating as beauty. Was she destined to be misunderstood forever, first as merely beautiful, then as unnaturally smart? By 1940, the world was burning. In Europe, Nazi Germany had conquered Poland, France, and much of the continent. In the Atlantic, German U-boats were hunting Allied vessels with devastating effectiveness. And in Hollywood, Hedy Lamarr was reading the headlines with the knowledge she had gained from her first husband's munitions business. Knowledge that suggested a possible solution to one of the war's most pressing technical challenges. At a dinner party, she met George Antheil, a composer known for his avant-garde work and his willingness to experiment with unconventional sounds and synchronized instruments. Their conversation quickly moved beyond small talk to larger concerns about the war. Hedy said that she did not feel very comfortable sitting there in Hollywood and making lots of money when things were in such a state, Antheil would later recall. She wanted to contribute something meaningful to the war effort beyond selling war bonds and entertaining troops. The problem they discussed was both technical and strategic. Allied torpedoes were vulnerable to enemy jamming. German forces could detect and disrupt the radio signals that guided these weapons, rendering them ineffective. Ships were being sunk daily in the Atlantic, sailors were dying, and the technology that might save them remained frustratingly elusive. Traditional radio guidance systems used single, steady frequencies that were easy for enemies to locate and jam. But what if, Hedy wondered, drawing on her knowledge of both radio technology and music, the guidance signals didn't stay on one frequency? What if they jumped randomly from frequency to frequency like a player piano changing musical notes? An enemy trying to jam such a signal would be like someone trying to stop a song by covering just one key on a piano. They might disrupt individual notes, but the melody would continue. Antheil, whose experimental compositions had featured multiple synchronized player pianos, immediately understood the concept. His 1924 work, Ballet Mécanique, had required precise timing between multiple pianos playing identical roles, exactly the kind of synchronization that would be needed for frequency-hopping radio signals. Together, they began developing the technical details that would turn Hedy's insight into a practical invention. Their secret communication system, as they called it, used the same player piano technology that had inspired Antheil's compositions. Piano rolls would control both the transmitter and receiver, causing them to hop between frequencies in perfect synchronization. To anyone intercepting the signals, it would sound like random noise, but to the intended receiver hopping frequencies at the same intervals, the message would be perfectly clear. Was this moment two unlikely collaborators solving a military problem over dinner conversation? Perhaps one of the most important meetings in the history of technology. By late 1940, they had developed their concept enough to submit it to the newly formed National Inventors Council. The government response was encouraging. They were introduced to Samuel Stewart McKeown, a professor of electrical engineering at Caltech, who helped refine the technical specifications. Hedy hired the law firm of Lyon & Lyon to draft the patent application. On August 11, 1942, U.S. Patent 2,292,387 was granted under her legal name at the time, Hedy Keesler Markey. But then, silence. The military classified their work as top secret and filed it away. Some sources suggest they considered the technology too complex for practical implementation. Others hint that the Navy was reluctant to take seriously an invention from a Hollywood actress. The bitter irony was that Hedy Lamarr, whose beauty had opened doors throughout her life, found that same beauty now closing the door to recognition for her intellectual achievements. The patent expired in 1959, without Hedy receiving a penny in royalties or credit. By the 1960s, the military had rediscovered frequency-hopping technology and was using it to control drones in Vietnam. The principles she had invented were becoming fundamental to secure communications, but her name was nowhere to be found in the technical literature. Could this represent the ultimate tragedy of her life? To create something vital for humanity while remaining completely invisible as its creator? The decade following her patent application marked the pinnacle of Hedy's Hollywood career. But it was a peak built on the very contradictions that had defined her life. Her beauty had never been more celebrated. Her films had never been more successful. Yet she had never felt more empty or misunderstood. The world saw Delilah. She was building Wi-Fi. Samson and Delilah, 1949, directed by Cecil B. DeMille, became her greatest commercial success as the biblical temptress who destroys the strongest man in the world through seduction. Hedy embodied every fantasy and fear that Hollywood had about feminine power. Audiences flocked to see her in elaborate costumes and dramatic makeup, playing a woman who used her beauty as a weapon. Movie theater opening night. Thousands of faces illuminated by the same image. Hedy as Delilah, seductive and dangerous. Her Beverly Hills home, same night, empty rooms. At the inventing table, frequency charts spread across technical diagrams. The disconnect was complete. But behind the glamour, Hedy was increasingly uncomfortable with the limitations of her public image. In interviews, she spoke with growing frustration about being typecast, about being valued only for her appearance, about the industry's inability to see beyond her face. "I am not a film star," she insisted. "I am an actress. I want to play character parts, not just be a beautiful woman in beautiful clothes." Her attempts to break free from typecasting largely failed. When her MGM contract ended in 1945, she tried to take control of her career by establishing her own production company. It was a bold move for any actor in that era, and particularly audacious for a woman. But the films she produced didn't find audiences, and by 1949 she was back to playing exotic temptresses in Samson and Delilah. The personal cost of fame was becoming apparent. She spent much of her time feeling lonely and homesick, avoiding beaches and public places where crowds might gather. When fans asked for autographs, she genuinely wondered why anyone would want them. The disconnect between her public image as a goddess of beauty and her private reality as an isolated, intellectually frustrated woman was growing into an unbridgeable chasm. Her private life reflected this same pattern of seeking connection and finding disappointment. After her divorce from Fritz Mandl, she would marry 5 more times. To screenwriter Gene Markey, actor John Loder, nightclub owner Ernest Stauffer, oil millionaire W. Howard Lee, and lawyer Louis W. Boys, Jr. Each marriage began with hope and ended with the same fundamental problem. Her husbands had fallen in love with Hedy Lamarr, the movie star, not with Hedwig Kiesler, the inventor. John Loder, her third husband and the father of 2 of her children, perhaps understood her best. He recognized her intelligence and supported her interests, but even he struggled with the complexity of a woman who could shift seamlessly between discussing advanced mathematics and preparing for a glamorous photo shoot. She was too smart for most men, he later admitted, and too beautiful for them to take her intelligence seriously. Was this perhaps the cruelest paradox of her existence? That the very qualities that made her extraordinary also made her impossible for others to fully comprehend or love. The 1940s also brought her greatest secret achievement and her greatest secret disappointment. While Samson and Delilah was earning millions at the box office, her frequency-hopping invention was gathering dust in military files. She had contributed what would eventually be recognized as a foundational technology for modern communications, but received no recognition, no compensation, no acknowledgement that the beautiful actress had also been a pioneering inventor. The irony was devastating. By day, she played Delilah, a woman who destroyed a man's strength through seduction. By night, she worked at her inventing table, creating technology that would eventually strengthen countless military and civilian communication systems. They asked her beauty secrets. She gave them equations. The world saw the destroyer. The creator remained hidden. Was this the price of being born both beautiful and brilliant in an era that insisted women could be only one thing at a time? She was still being half seen, celebrated for destruction on screen, invisible for creation at home. The 1950s arrived like a cold wind through Hollywood's golden dreams. The studio system that had created Hedy Lamarr was beginning to crumble. Television was changing entertainment, and a generation of stars who had defined the 1940s suddenly found themselves struggling to remain relevant. For Hedy, the decade would bring professional disappointment, personal scandal, and a growing sense that both her beauty and her intelligence had become curses rather than gifts. Her film career, which had never fully satisfied her artistic ambitions, began its inevitable decline. The exotic roles that had made her famous in the 1940s felt increasingly outdated in the 1950s. Audiences wanted different kinds of stories, different kinds of stars. At 40, Hedy found herself competing not just with younger actresses, but with an entirely new entertainment medium that brought celebrities directly into people's homes. Her last significant film, The Female Animal, 1958, was a low-budget production that few people saw and fewer remembered. It marked the end of a career that had made her one of the most photographed women in history, but had never allowed her to demonstrate the full range of her abilities. She was 53 years old, still beautiful, but increasingly irrelevant in an industry that had always valued her primarily for her youth and appearance. Personal scandals began to accumulate like gathering storm clouds. In 1966, she was arrested for shoplifting in a Los Angeles department store, a bizarre incident that suggested deeper psychological struggles. The charges were eventually dropped, but the damage to her reputation was severe. The woman who had once been called the world's most beautiful was now portrayed in tabloids as a troubled has-been actress. That same year, she published her autobiography, Ecstasy and Me, a shockingly candid memoir that revealed details about her marriages, her affairs, and her struggles with loneliness and depression. The book became a bestseller, but Hedy later sued her collaborators, claiming they had distorted her words and misrepresented her experiences. Whether the book accurately reflected her thoughts or was ghost-written sensationalism, it painted a picture of a woman who had been damaged by fame and was struggling to find meaning beyond her image. Could this public exposure of her private pain have been a desperate attempt to finally be seen in her full complexity? Flawed, intelligent, lonely, and human? A second shoplifting arrest in 1991 reinforced the public perception that Hedy's life had become a cautionary tale about the perils of celebrity. She was 77 years old, living alone in Florida, and the incident seemed to confirm that the glamorous star of Samson and Delilah had fallen far from grace. But was this truly failure? Or was it perhaps the inevitable result of a society that had refused to see her as anything more than a beautiful face? The deeper tragedy was not her decline as a celebrity, but her continued invisibility as an inventor. Throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, as her patent expired and was forgotten, the technology she had co-created was quietly revolutionizing communications. Military contractors developed frequency-hopping systems for secure communications. Engineers built upon her principles to create new forms of radio guidance and interference-resistant transmission. By the 1980s, the concept she had pioneered was becoming the foundation for consumer technologies that would eventually connect the entire world. But the name on the original patent, Hedy Lamarr, meant nothing to the engineers who were transforming her idea into reality. They might have known her movie roles, but they had no idea that the beautiful actress had also been their intellectual predecessor. The isolation was profound and painful. She had created something that was making the world more connected, yet she herself remained more isolated than ever. She had given birth to technologies that would eventually allow instant communication across continents, yet she struggled to connect with people in her own neighborhood. Was this coincidence? Or was it perhaps the cruelest irony of her entire life? But even in decline, hints of her true nature persisted. Neighbors in her Florida community occasionally glimpsed a sharp intelligence behind her reclusiveness. She would engage in detailed discussions about technology and science with anyone who showed genuine interest, demonstrating that her curious mind remained as active as ever. The problem wasn't that she had lost her brilliance, it was that the world had never learned to recognize it in the first place. As the 1980s became the 1990s, Hedy retreated further into solitude. She lived alone in an unremarkable house in Castleberry, Florida, far from the Hollywood glamour that had defined her public image. She slept during the day and stayed awake at night, watching old movies, including her own films. Neighbors reported seeing her collecting mail by flashlight, moving carefully with a cane, acknowledging no one. But isolation also brought a kind of freedom. Without the pressures of maintaining a public image, she could finally be herself completely. She continued to invent, to tinker, to satisfy the curiosity that had driven her since childhood. She worked on new traffic light designs, improved household gadgets, solutions to everyday problems. The inventing table was still active, even if the world had stopped paying attention to what happened there. In 1997, when she was 83 years old, something remarkable occurred. A group of engineers researching the history of frequency-hopping technology discovered that the Hedy Lamarr listed on a 1942 patent was actually Hedy Lamarr, the movie star. Small Florida house evening. Blue television light flickered across an aged face. On the coffee table, official letters from the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Recognition. Finally, after 55 years, her hands shook as she read. Pioneer Award. Achievement Award. The words she had waited her entire life to see. But the triumph felt hollow. Too late, too little, too lonely. For the first time in over 50 years, the world acknowledged that Hedy Lamarr was more than just a beautiful face. But she was too proud, too hurt, too tired to fully embrace the vindication she had deserved for decades. Was this perhaps the ultimate tragedy? That understanding came only when it could no longer heal the wounds of a lifetime of being misunderstood. The recognition came with other awards and honors. The Bulby Nass Spirit of Achievement Bronze Award from the Jewish Museum. Various technology organizations began acknowledging her contributions. But for Hedy, these accolades felt like echoes from another lifetime. She had spent 80 years being celebrated for her beauty and dismissed for her intelligence. Now, when her beauty had faded and her body was failing, the world finally wanted to praise her mind. She rarely left her house, rarely spoke to reporters, rarely acknowledged the growing recognition. The woman who had once commanded millions at the box office now lived on a modest pension. Her inventive mind still active, but her spirit worn down by decades of being misunderstood. The cruel mathematics of her life were becoming clear. She had been given two extraordinary gifts, devastating beauty and revolutionary intelligence, but had lived in an era that insisted she could only be valued for one. January 19th, 2000. The call that would have broken Hedy's heart if she had been alive to receive it came on a morning in 2014. The National Inventors Hall of Fame was calling to inform her family that she would be posthumously inducted for her frequency-hopping spread-spectrum technology. The same invention that had been dismissed and forgotten in 1942 was now recognized as foundational to modern wireless communication. By then, Wi-Fi networks connected billions of devices around the world. Bluetooth technology enabled seamless communication between phones, computers, and cars. GPS systems guided travelers across continents and helped rescue teams locate people in distress. Every smartphone, every laptop, every connected device owed something to the frequency-hopping principles that Hedy Lamarr and George Antheil had patented 72 years earlier. But Hedy had died 14 years too soon to witness this recognition. At age 85, she passed away alone in her Castleberry home. her body discovered by a housekeeper who found her in the bedroom where she had spent so many sleepless nights watching her old films. There were no crowds of mourners, no Hollywood funeral, no final recognition of her dual legacy as both beauty and genius. Her son Anthony scattered some of her ashes in Vienna's woods, fulfilling her final wishes to return in some form to the city where her journey had begun. The rest of her remains were later interred in Vienna's central cemetery, not far from other Austrian luminaries who had shaped the world through their intellectual contributions. It was a fitting resting place for someone who had always belonged more to the world of ideas than to the world of celebrity. The question that haunted her life haunts her death. What if society had been capable of seeing both sides of her nature from the beginning? What if the beautiful actress had also been celebrated as a brilliant inventor? What if Hedy Lamarr had lived in a world that allowed women to be complex, multifaceted, simultaneously beautiful and intelligent without having to choose between these qualities? In 2017, the documentary Bombshell: The Hedy Lamarr Story introduced a new generation to her complete legacy. For the first time, audiences could see archival footage of her discussing scientific principles, demonstrating her technical knowledge, speaking passionately about invention and innovation. The woman who had been forced to stand still and look stupid was finally revealed as she had always been. Curious, analytical, creative, and brilliant. Google honored her with animated doodles on her birthday, celebrating both her contributions to film and her technological innovations. An asteroid was named after her. Technology companies began acknowledging her foundational role in wireless communications. The recognition kept growing, but it all came too late for Hedy herself to enjoy. Her story became a touchstone for discussions about women in science and technology. How many other Hedy Lamarrs had been overlooked? How many brilliant minds had been dismissed because they didn't fit society's narrow expectations? Her life became both inspiration and warning, proof that genius can emerge from unexpected places, but also evidence of how much talent society has wasted by refusing to see people in their full complexity. The irony of her legacy is perfect and devastating. The woman who died in isolation, collecting mail by flashlight and avoiding human contact, had created technology